So we're going to pick up here with the concept of akrasia. Akrasia is an ancient Greek word. I think it translates directly into weak will, but these days it kind of means something different. So an instance of akrasia is when you know you should do A, but instead you do B. And Rosen, I don't think he, you know what, I just can't remember if he calls it soft akrasia versus genuine, but other people have picked up that terminology, and he talks about both instances. So akrasia is doing something when you know that you shouldn't. Soft akrasia is when we convince ourselves that the thing we know we shouldn't do, we convince ourselves that the thing we should do. So, you know, I'm looking at these two options. Should I steal or not steal? And then I sort of intuitively know immediately, like, well, stealing somebody else's property, will cause harm to them, and I shouldn't do it. And this is, let's make it a clear case. Literally stealing like a lollipop from a baby, you shouldn't do that. I'm going to take a firm stance on that one. And I realize it's going to make the baby upset. And then I start to think about how much I really want that lollipop, and I'm like, the pleasure that that lollipop will give me is greater than the pleasure will give the baby. The lollipop will give the baby, right? He's so young. I don't even know if he is like self-aware yet. And, he's not even self-aware enough to really appreciate that lollipop. But I am. You know what? The right thing to do is to maximize happiness in the world, and I will get more happiness out of that sucker. Okay, you know what? I'm going to steal that sucker. So that's an instance of soft akrasia, when we deceptively convince ourselves that the wrong thing is the right thing to do. Genuine akrasia is just plain and simple. I know I shouldn't do it, but I do it anyway. I know that I should run more often, but I don't. I know that I should work. It's Friday afternoon. I know that I should continue to work, but I'm like, you know what? I just don't want to, and I quit. Just instance of akrasia. I know I should do something, and I just don't. I know I should give more to charity, but I don't. So that's genuine akrasia. So, how often do you think agents act from ignorance? Seems like it's not that often. If someone decides to do a bad thing, right, so in an instance of soft akrasia, that's like halfway. It's kind of this instance of acting from ignorance, right? Because I have convinced myself the right thing to do is to steal the sucker. One way to describe that situation is that I'm ignorant of the fact that I shouldn't do it. So, one of the important things that Rosen brings up is, what does it take for an agent to act wrongly and it to not be an instance of ignorance? It seems like we can think of when we think about somebody doing something morally wrong, we don't typically think of them as acting from ignorance. We think of them as just, doing we think of these more as in terms of like genuine akrasia. They know they shouldn't, and they do it anyway. And in order for that to be the case, the agent would need to know the pertinent moral and non-moral facts, and know that what she's doing is a morally bad thing. So finally, we're gonna put all the pieces together and get to this. Here's like sub-conclusion 1. Everything we've said so far leads to this fact. Every locus of responsibility must be an acratic act. So every blameworthy action must either be itself an acratic act, so an act where I realize what the right thing is, but I don't do it, or must be the upshot of an acratic act. So, why does it have to be an upshot of an acratic act? Because that's sort of the only way to get there. Either an action has to directly be like, hey, I know I'm doing something wrong and I'm going to do it anyway. Or it has to be the upshot of that, like, hey, I know driving drunk's wrong, I'm going to do it anyway, and then I get in a wreck. And that's the upshot of an acratic act. So this, I say it leads to a skeptic conclusion, but it's really conclusion point 1, we're rarely or never justified in blaming people. Put a pause on that. You know what? I'm going to delete that. I don't like that. Boop. Gone. So all of this comes together. I don't have it written down now. That's okay. To this conclusion, well, the locus of responsibility, always, the only thing somebody can be blameworthy for has to be an instance of genuine or soft acrasia. However, as we just stated right here, soft acrasia is a kind of ignorance. And Rosen wants to say instances of genuine acrasia, he thinks, are actually pretty rare when we say that, you know what, I know what the right thing to do is, but I'm not going to do it. He thinks they happen, but they're rare. What he thinks is much, much more common are instances of soft acrasia. And it's really difficult to tell when an agent is blameworthy for soft acrasia. Here's why. So soft acrasia, remember, is when we convince ourselves to do some self-serving, morally bad thing. But it's not like a conscious decision. And once we have settled on that plan, the self-serving, morally bad one, it looks like that's the right thing to do, and it looks like that's an instance of genuine ignorance. When we look at all the facts and we weigh them to the best of our ability, but we're missing some crucial moral fact, that's an instance of ignorance. And what Rosen is going to say, or what he does say, is that that ignorance doesn't trace back to another blameworthy action. So he does say that, yes, agents are blameworthy for genuine acrasia. He thinks it's fuzzy whether agents are blameworthy for soft acrasia. And he thinks soft acrasia is the far more common of the two. So that means the overwhelming majority of things that we are blameworthy for are either instances of soft acrasia or trace back to soft acrasia. And whether or not agents are blameworthy for soft acrasia, we just don't know. So you can ask yourself, yes, is an agent blameworthy for convincing themselves to do the wrong thing? You know, there probably is an answer to that. But this is it. We got there. Here's what Rosen's going to say. When it comes to actual, non-theoretic, practical life, and I'm looking at another agent, I am never, or at least almost never, justified in a belief that an agent is blameworthy for a current or past soft-acratic act. I can't look into their head and see the reasoning that they chose to, cause themselves to either be ignorant or do the wrong thing. So the way that Rosen sees things is that most of our wrong actions are caused by ignorance of the moral facts, and ignorance of the moral facts typically, not always, but typically come from acrasia. But I'm never in a position to know, like me, Chad. I can never look at a person who has supposedly wronged me and know whether they are blameworthy for the origin of that action, which is, according to Rosen, typically soft acrasia. And even if I could pinpoint, like, yes, this is the instance of soft acrasia that led to this thing where they wronged me, because minds are opaque. I can't see into your mind to know whether you are actually blameworthy for that soft acrasia. So soft acrasia is the origin of the overwhelming majority of bad actions, morally blameworthy actions, but I'm never in a position to judge if a person is blameworthy for their soft acrasia. Therefore, here it is, I'm never in a position to judge that an agent is blameworthy, or almost never. So, that's how all the pieces about ignorance, derivative responsibility, and acrasia all lead to this skeptical conclusion. It's not that moral responsibility doesn't exist, it's that we as individuals are never in a position to judge when another agent is blameworthy. And again, it's because their blameworthy act traces back to something else, typically some ignorance of a moral fact, and the ignorance of that moral fact is typically due to soft acrasia, and we can never know, or at least it's extremely difficult to know whether they are blameworthy for that soft acrasia. So that's his skeptical conclusion. I wanted to also explain, so that's his version of sort of an epistemic problem with moral responsibility. I think what's actually the focus, in the past decade has been what I what I put one sentence on right here. So a lot of our character formation takes place when we're younger. So think about your high school years, and you're just sort of coming to terms with, okay, I want to be, I have this control over the person I want to be, and you're starting to pick up on cues about where you want to fit in with a social group and society. Look, as teenagers, we just lacked the knowledge about how our character would form over time. Like, you just don't know that the actions you start doing in high school are going to lead, going to form into habits that will form your character. I mean, I could tell you that, but I don't think very many high schoolers take it seriously. Their brains aren't developed enough yet to really understand that these are character-forming actions. Well, if you believe that actions are a result of our attitudes, and our attitudes are a result of character-forming actions, many of the character-forming actions we took, we just didn't know that they were, one, character-forming, or two, they could have bad consequences. And remember, one of the epistemic condition says we have to have knowledge that something bad will happen, right? So I swung the door open. I never knew you were there. I swung the door open. I'm not blameworthy because I didn't have knowledge something bad would happen. Well, if we didn't have knowledge something bad would happen when we made these character-forming decisions, well, it seems like we're not blameworthy. So that's the sort of line of skepticism that this essay really brought forward. What did I put here? There's nothing here. I just realized this slide goes to another, wrote this on the wrong slide. So that's it for Rosen, right? So again, just to reiterate, it's not a metaphysical argument like Van and Wagens and Peerboom's about the nature of the world or the nature of stuff. It's an argument about knowledge, so it's an epistemic argument. And again, unlike them, there's one version of the epistemic argument which I outlined with this sentence right here, which says, well, moral responsibility doesn't exist because we never meet the conditions for it. Rosen's even sort of taking a more subtle approach, and because of that subtlety, it makes it super effective. He's saying we're just never justified in making these judgments or these ascriptions of blameworthiness, and because of that, attitudes like resentment and indignation are not justified, retributive punishment won't be justified, and you're going to lead to a world just like the one that Peerboom describes. So I think it's very interesting that, moral responsibility metaphysically may very well exist, but because of our lack of knowledge, it still leads to the outcome that Peerboom says we should adopt. So I think that's interesting. So I wanted to give you a skeptical response to a compatibilist like Frankfurt, and then after this, we're going to see a kind of theory about moral responsibility that can avoid this, and then we'll end it out with another argument that shows why those theories are lacking. So it's going to be this back and forth dialectic. All right.